A very good evening and a warm welcome to Weekend Dialogue on Bids Roundup. Tonight on Weekend Dialogue, we are going to discuss about the interim budget brought in by the new government, and for that we have with us an academic who best suits to discuss this topic, as he has had private sector experience as well as government sector experience, and of course he is a well-known academic in Sri Lanka. Let me warmly welcome Mr. Indrajith Aponso, Senior Lecturer in Economics at the Colombo University. He's also a member, a consult, private sector think tank. So let me welcome Mr. Indrajith Aponso to our studios. Good to have you back. The budget was presented in Parliament on Thursday. Various opinions have been expressed. Some say it's only a Robin Hood style budget, but others say it has actually focused on the neglected population of the country. What is your view?
Well, when I read the budget, it is a bit surprising to me because it's coming from a very much capitalistic favored the United National Party based government, because UNP is generally the private sector oriented political party in this country for historical times, but this particular budget does seem to show something quite different from the tradition. So which is a kind of a surprising element to me. Second point is that there has been over the last several years, under the previous regime, the private sector has not been, I would say, not been getting their share of opportunities to exploit the infrastructure developments, the stability, political stability that have been in the country. So which was reflected as a low level of investments and low level of private sector engagements. So I was hoping that that there will be something different being brought forward in this budget, though it is an interim budget. I say that because we are talking about 7.8% economic growth, but of course we got to sustain a much larger economic growth, and there it has to come from the private sector engagement in a very effective way. So I'm yet to find the true pulses of the private sector, but as an academic who had some exposure with the private sector, my thinking is there is a not adequate emphasis provided for that aspect of economic growth.
But why would this have happened by a party with a majority of the UNP parliamentarians, and the UNP is a private sector oriented party? How could this have happened, just as you mentioned?
I think if you go back the history, you can remember when Mrs. Chandrika Kumaratunga government came into power in 1995. SLFP and the left alliance of the SLFP was very much a socialistic base they were advocating, but there was a shift at that time. That shift was they embrace capitalism in they call it capitalism with human face, so which is social developments but within a market framework.
Right.
So this kind of robbed the opportunity that the UNP had at that time. So that went on. Then there was 2000 to 2002. There was a short government under the regime of the Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, the UNP, and they went all out to create what is called a very pro-market government, and wanted to sort of forget about the other public sector engagements, and that was a disaster. So then I would think that they have thought the way forward now is to go with the mainstream thinking, that so you go for very welfare oriented budgets. That's one explanation. The second explanation is the present government is a coalition government, which is a heterogeneous coalition government, which had though parties like JVP are not part of the government,
Right.
but they were part of the team which ousted the previous regime. So it shows the kind of forces that are working within the coalition, and that reflects at the end of the day that the UNP seems to be seen as a party with a difference, which probably be appealing to the public, especially in expectation of an election in the very short term.
Are you saying that this budget would have mainly targeted an upcoming election so that they could win the hearts of the masses?
I am quite inclined to think that way, because if not for that, I just can't find any other reason that the budget is so much biased towards expenditure and handouts and making people happy, I would say, in the short term.
So is this relief unnecessary?
Well, I think relief is very much necessary. But the point is that you can give relief only if you focus on the basic fundamentals of economic wealth creation. That is, you got to create the growth momentum, you got to get the harness the forces that are responsible for this growth momentum. So, as I mentioned earlier, there was this neglect of the true private sector entrepreneurial initiatives, and I would imagine that if you are putting up a budget, that budget should have looked forward to a longer term or a medium term vision, rather than looking for a short term outcome as politically biased as election in this particular case.
What challenges do you think will focus in that case? I mean, neglecting the private sector, the engine of growth, what challenges would Sri Lanka face in the longer term?
I think well, I mean, it is fundamentally problematic if one does not recognize the role the private sector should be playing in an upcoming economy like Sri Lanka. Because if you look at all the countries that are growing rapidly, the private sector had been playing a very significant or a main driver role. Then one would ask, okay, what would be the roles the other players must be playing? This reminds me of one of a colleague of mine who at a lecture said, private sector is the engine of growth, the government is the gearbox. So which is basically a facilitator and which accelerates the economic growth process, but it's not the main driving force. So in that respect, you got to balance it very well if you want to get the bus running for a longer sustained journey.
Also, Mr. Aponso, talking about the investment policies, this budget does show that there are a few changes in investment policies, taxes, specifically on the casino tax. Despite the stance maintained by the two different parties, the previous government and the present government, what do you think is the message that we actually give out to foreign investors? Do you think this signals out stability in policies in Sri Lanka, or does this show a detrimental situation for the country's foreign direct investment situation at a time when Sri Lanka is trying to focus on bringing in increased amounts of FDIs?
I think this is a very important point. Throughout the budget, I could see that there is a kind of demonization of certain enterprises which had come during the last regime. Just put yourself into a situation of a private investor. They had to deal with the existing regime. Sometimes there are things that had taken place which are not in a proper manner, but that doesn't mean that you completely dilute the expectations of an investor. So first, my point is, even if you have to say something, think rectification, you've got to handle it with a lot of care, a lot of respect for the investors, because investors have choices. They don't have to come to Sri Lanka. They can go to anywhere they like. So it's we who want investors to come here. Now take for example, these casinos. I mean, let's talk about casinos. Casinos are not patronized by people in this country, right? But casinos are part of a certain kinds of investments and who are coming to this country and other countries as well. And on the other hand, we have tourism. The tourism also linked to in a certain segments of tourism are linked to this specific entertainment aspect. So my whole point is, you got to take a holistic view rather than taking a piecemeal view and looking at in a very negative way and sending a message across to the rest of the world. Look, we have these changes, and we do it the way we want without any regard to who has come. So from a foreign investments point of view, I do fear that these kind of changes may have a negative message being sent across the globe for the investors, because any regime that comes in will have a set of policies, and once it changes, another set of policies which an investor cannot accommodate.
If we actually analyze the revenue and expenditure of this interim budget, 1.6 trillion rupees expected to be collected as grants. Of that revenue is estimated, tax revenue is about 1.5 trillion rupees. How do you see the composition here?
Now, tax revenue has always been a problem in Sri Lankan context. If you look at over the last 10-15 years, the tax revenues as a percentage of GDP, the GDP is the total value of the output on a country, and the tax revenue is what the government appropriates in order to meet the expenses of running infrastructure, running social services. So government does not earn money itself, government has to tax, so that's the main revenue. So, but what has happened here, something odd has happened in the Sri Lankan context, that is, despite the fact that we are talking about high economic growth and fairly decent growth in GDP, our tax revenues as a proportion of the GDP has been coming down. We have been I think 1990 the tax revenue has been around 19% to 20% of GDP, which has dropped to about 11% of GDP. Now that puts the expenditure front under tremendous pressure, because the expenditure pressure keeps on growing, and whereas the tax revenues, main revenue source of the government, has been for some reason lagging behind. So this does not look very good. So this requires some of the major structural changes to the way the taxes are being collected and to the way the revenues have been collected. In the past, much of the revenues, well, when I say tax revenues, I need to make a qualification here. Tax revenues, the income tax revenues in particular, has been very poor in terms of the GDP. So in order to supplement the revenue shortfall, governments in the past have been resorting to value added taxes and sales taxes. When we teach about taxes, there are two kinds of taxes. One is called progressive taxes, the other is called regressive taxes. The progressive taxes are generally favored because higher the income, you pay a higher amount of taxes. But in the regressive taxes, what you find is the poor people pay a larger percentage of taxes compared to the rich people. So this is precisely the anomaly in the value added taxes. So the structure of taxation has also been very I would say unsatisfactory.
Wouldn't we have expected something better from the new government in terms of expanding the tax net? And
that is a difficult task, I would say, in a 100 days program. Taxes are always a complicated area, and income taxes in particular have been extremely complicated. However, if one does adjust the value added taxes, the benefit of those taxes are going to be widespread. So it is going to the entire community because they are all based on consumption. So I would say that in the budget I would have expected more reductions in the value added taxes as a very inclusive concessions to all citizens, not few groups of individual who are getting salary increases and so on and so forth.
Right. Talking about the debt, the country's debt, this budget document shows that it exceeds 8.5 trillion rupees. Now, this is massive. However, Finance Minister Ravi Karnanaik, presenting the interim budget, also stated that the previous budget did not include the debt of state-owned enterprises, and that the state of the economy is worse than it was expected. What is your observation?
Well, you can bring in there are direct debts that you can calculate, and then there are indirect debts that can be calculated. So it's a matter of how you look at these figures. You know, these are I mean, these are there anyway. You know, one may not have put as the debt the total figure. So it's one's choice. You know, I would imagine that the last government probably wanted to show a lower debt figure. Now, on the other hand, I think, you know, the debt to GDP ratio is a barometer for countries outside Sri Lanka in particular, not the people who are inside the country. For them to look at the debt to GDP ratio is to look at how sustainable these debt levels are, how healthy the economy is. Then, so that's one aspect of it. That is, you know, the size of the debt matters to the outside investors and other parties who are lending to us. Second point about debt is, now debt can have different types of debt. There are short-term debts, there are long-term debts. The debt per se is not a serious problem if the debt is not very short-term, highly commercial rates based. So its composition of debt is also important here. But on the other hand, however, how
do we look at the debt composition in Sri Lanka now? 8.5 trillion rupees.
8.5 trillion rupees. I don't have the exact breakdown of the debt, how the debt are the structure, you know. So but I would imagine during the last government regime, during the last regime, there has been quite a lot of debt that have been borrowed in commercial terms, and though sometimes things are bilateral, and so as a result, you know, if there is a larger chunk of these debts coming into the total debt portfolio, which can have a kind of pressure on the overall picture the Sri Lanka presents to the rest of the world.
Right. So I think on that note, it's time we wrap up, Mr. Aponso. But thank you very much for your time here in our studios.
Thank you very much.
We had with us Mr. Indrajith Aponso, Senior Lecturer in Economics at the Colombo University, also a member, a consult, private sector think tank, joining us on Weekend Dialogue. Stay with us, we have more on Biz Roundup on the other side of the break.